Some often overlooked St. Louis civil rights history comes to light in a new book. We'll have that story next on City Corner. I'm Steve Potter, and welcome to City Corner. Our guest today is Amanda Doyle. She is the author of several books that you've probably heard about. The author of Finally, a locally produced guidebook by and for St. Louisans, 100 Things to Do in St. Louis Before You Die, and To the Top, a Gateway Arch Story. Hi, Amanda. Welcome back to the program.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
And now you, along with co-author Melanie Adams, have written Standing Up for Civil Rights in St. Louis.
Yes, a little bit of a change from my usual territory of current-day St. Louis.
And it's designed, I would say, not specifically for children, but with children in mind. How would you put it?
It is. It's aimed at an upper elementary school reading level, which makes it accessible for kids, although the subject matter, at least to me, was almost all new information that I was not that aware of about St. Louis. So,
what do you mean? I thought we knew all that history. St. Louis has had a very long and fascinating history with civil rights. And
it has, yes. And I think the highlights, like a lot of people, I knew like Dred Scott and some of the issues around slavery in that era, but I was not that familiar with a lot of the names that we see around us every day when we drive around St. Louis. So it was a real education for me. So I would say anyone from, third grade to on up would be fine. My age. Yeah, there's a lot to learn for sure.
We'll get to more of this in just a second, but this book is published by the Missouri History Press.
Correct.
The other books I mentioned, you've done Reedy Press, which is a local publisher a lot of people know, and I just wanted to ask you an update because back in December, was it December or November?
It was November.
In November, there was this huge warehouse fire. It made all the news, and everyone remembers seeing it on TV. Mm-hmm. And it was a warehouse where Reedy Press books were stored. I want to say millions. I'll say thousands and thousands.
Hundreds of thousands. Yep,
hundreds of thousands,
for sure.
Including yours and a lot of other people. This is a picture that you actually took, right?
Yeah, this was the afternoon of the fire. So the fire had been burning for quite a while at that point, and I walked down to pick up my daughter from school, 2 blocks from my house, and standing on the playground, I was able to still see my books burning all afternoon. So
yeah, as I remember those accounts, didn't it burn for, was it a day or two?
Oh, it was a couple of days active, and then they thought it was out, and then it flared up again apparently a few days later. So it was an insane situation and a long-lasting fire.
So what did Amanda Doyle have in that warehouse?
Almost all the copies of all those other books you mentioned. I had been by the warehouse a few days before to pick up a few boxes for holiday sales and things like that I was planning to do. So I had probably 2.5 boxes of assorted titles in the back of my Toyota, and otherwise everything is gone. So
wow. How are they doing?
They're doing okay. It was insured, which is helpful. So that helped pay for the loss of titles, but it was right before Christmas, which is a huge time when people are buying books, especially those fancy, big, pretty gift books
right.
that are pricey to buy, but also they make the most money for a publisher and an author.
Coffee table books.
Coffee table books. So they were insured, which is great, but then the expense of reprinting is huge, and also just missing that window of Christmas sales, it's something that's hard to come back from. So they are on the track to reprinting as many of the titles as possible. I think about half of them so far have been reprinted. But hundreds of authors.
But the book you did about the Arch won't be around for a while?
The Arch book is not getting reprinted right now, so there are copies still at a few stores around town I've seen, but I personally have literally 2 copies at my house. I have 2 kids, so I have to save those for them.
That warehouse, that was an old building once?
It was, I think it was built in the 20s, and it was built originally as a tobacco storage facility, like for drying leaves of tobacco. So which is great if you're in the tobacco business, but bad if you have a fire, because there's a lot of oxygen coming through there. And if you have boxes full of paper, like books.
Right.
It's kind of the best thing to burn, really.
So do they have a new warehouse?
You know what? The Missouri Botanical Garden had very generously lent warehouse space to Reedy, so they have been using borrowed space for a while, but they're actively, they may have one by now. I know they've been actively looking.
Well, I'm going to
So-
wish my best to Josh Stevens and the rest of the staff, because I know they must have been through heck the last couple of months.
Yeah, I think it was initially it was just shocking to all of us, especially, they have authors around the country, but the majority of titles are St. Louis titles. So it was surreal at the beginning, and then it was just really sad after that. But we had a little party right before Christmas for the authors, but also for people who wanted to come and support it, and make a donation and pre-purchase books. That was kind of the goal, like pre-buy some of these titles so that you can be a part of the reprinting efforts. So I think that boosted morale a lot, and just to see, people were worried, like, oh, will it survive? Will my books come back? And to see it happening is heartening.
So it'll be fine down the road.
It'll be fine down the road,
Good,
yes.
good. We wish
And
them
if
the
you've
best.
got one of those books that was just out, you may have a collector's edition, because who knows for sure if they're going to be reprinted, all of them or not. So hang on to whatever Reedy Press books you have.
Okay, definitely. I certainly will do that. Well, we mentioned you co-authored this book, Standing Up for Civil Rights in St. Louis, with Melanie Adams, who long time ago did a show on on STL TV.
Yes.
And she was affiliated, was she the PR person for the Missouri History Museum?
She was in the education department at the History Museum, so worked a lot with their education programs, their school programs.
Well, you've always written for Reedy Press, so how did you get together with Melanie for this?
Well, the Missouri History Museum still has an exhibit up called Number 1 in Civil Rights, about St. Louis civil rights history.
It'll be up the rest of the year, won't it?
It'll be, I think it's through the spring.
Okay.
So they were looking to publish a book in conjunction with the exhibit, and this is the first time that they've published a book with the children's market in mind. So they put out a request for proposals, and I had a friend who said, oh, you should look at this. I kind of found out about it through the back channels. So I was really excited. I had just left my full-time day job, number one, so I was excited to have something to write about. And also, I have been really interested in this topic, talking to kids about civil rights, about racism, about equal justice.
What's interesting about you, I think, is, because we've talked about this before, you didn't grow up in St. Louis. You were
Right.
trying to think where now.
Memphis, mostly.
Yeah. And so you moved here, when I say recently, the last 10 years? 20 years. You know, time flies. But you were an adult, and you moved here with your husband.
Yes, I was an adult.
So I'm just guessing that the civil rights story in St. Louis was something you really weren't familiar with.
Not at all, and totally different from where I grew up. I grew up in the South, so what I knew about civil rights and race relations was very different from what the scene was here in some ways. So anyway, I sent in a proposal to the History Museum that I really wanted to do this. Here was my experience. And they asked me in to talk about it, to talk about what I had proposed as a book outline. And Melanie, who I had known Melanie for probably 20 years prior to that. I met her when I first moved to St. Louis. So she and I have been friends and worked on various projects together over the years, off and on. So I walked in and they said, we've been thinking about it, and we really would like to have a two-author situation, partly from the point of view that the History Museum is producing the book, so it would be great to have some of their staff involved in the book.
Right.
But also, Melanie has a deep history in educational access, equality of educational access. She did her PhD work all about Sumner High School, so she had this breadth of knowledge that I, who is an enthusiastic writer, did not have. I mean, I know how to research things and find out and write a book, but she just came with so much knowledge. So we paired up for it, and it was a really great partnership.
Oh, you have an event coming up that I want to mention on February the 10th.
Correct, yes.
Tell us about that.
Melanie and I will both be at the Florissant Valley branch of the St. Louis County Library, and it's part of their Black History Celebration in February. So it's at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and we'll be there talking. It's geared for families with kids, so people should bring their kids, and we'll be talking about some of the aspects of civil rights history in St. Louis that kids can still see today.
I'll tell Melanie everyone at STL TV says hello, because
I'll let her know.
She doesn't live here anymore.
No, she relocated right before the book came out, so it's been, I've been doing all the heavy lifting and talking about her, but she was here too. Yeah, she's in Minnesota now. She got a job at the Minnesota Historical Society and has an even bigger person job than she had here.
Okay, good. We'll give her our regards for sure.
I will do it.
I'm going to read something, just this first couple of sentences out of your introduction, have you comment on it, because I think it really kind of says something. Imagine slaves who stood up to their owners for their freedom. Picture women and men who sat inside restaurants that refused to serve black people day after day to make a point. Think of workers protesting outside of businesses that wouldn't hire people with the wrong skin color. Imagine students fighting for the right to go to the college of their choice. All of these things really happened in St. Louis. That's out of your introduction.
Right. It's one of the main points we wanted to get across, especially to kids who would read the book, is that it's easy to look back now and see these civil rights heroes and think like, oh, well, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was this great man. Rosa Parks was this very dedicated woman to the cause. And when you look back, it seems like they were always destined to be these pivotal figures. But the people who made change and who keep making change on every issue, but especially on civil rights issues, are just regular people. They are ordinary people who decide one day, this is not right, and I have to do something about it. So to point out that anybody can be an activist, that anybody can see something that is not right and say, that's not right, we need to change this, is something that we want to tell kids, because I think that gives them a sense of their own power, that they can do something to change even just something in their daily lives, maybe that they see. And that's where social change will come from, is kids feeling like they have a say.
And don't you think for some, I mean, everyone knows about slavery, we've read about it in history, we know that it existed, but don't you think for a lot of people, day to day, I don't know if people really can imagine what it was really like if they think hard long enough about it. You know what I'm saying?
I do, for sure. And especially for me as a white person, it's something that I can know about intellectually, but not really have to deal with in a lot of ways, because I don't have a family history that has been impacted generation after generation by these things. So I think that it's really, to put yourself as much as possible in the shoes of people who were like living their daily lives, what it looked like to them.
Well, you're from Memphis originally before you moved to St. Louis. Memphis isn't that far away.
Right.
At least geographically.
Yes.
So how did it strike you? How were race relations and just civil rights issues different in Memphis and St. Louis as you see it?
It's a little hard because I was a kid then, so I wasn't paying as much attention. But of course, growing up in Memphis, that it's the site where Dr. King was assassinated, so that's a huge part of the culture.
But did black people go through the same thing there as they did here as far as housing discrimination, what neighborhoods they could live in, and all that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that was pretty much everywhere. It's interesting because at least my family and where we grew up in Memphis, and my family was mostly from Mississippi, my family was always relatively poor, and so they were not as separated in some ways from poor black people as like a middle-class white family would have been.
But they still probably didn't socialize with black people.
Exactly.
People didn't do that.
Right. It wasn't, there wasn't like a huge mixing of people even at lower economic levels, for sure. Yeah. So it's been interesting though, because to come to a place that I don't consider St. Louis to be a southern place, because I feel like, well, no, I'm from the South.
Right.
But to come to a place that has the same issues, but like a whole different flavor in a way. It's interesting. Missouri was a border state during the Civil War, and so that had a lot of implications that we still see today. So it never seceded from the Union, but slavery was legal. It's a weird mix.
Yeah. Well, we got a lot of things to talk about. Some weird and some not.
All interesting, though. Yeah.
All interesting. It's Amanda Doyle. She and Melanie Adams have written Standing Up for Civil Rights in St. Louis. We're going to take this break. We'll be right back.
Life's taught me a lot, and I'm ready for more.
Well, you're not the typical kind of candidate that I hire. But you are exactly what I'm looking for.
Your company could be missing out on the candidates it needs most. Learn how to find a great pool of untapped talent at gradsoflife.org.
Hi. You think you're probably sober?
Yeah.
But you're thinking about taking the back roads home, just in case. Why would you do that?
Probably okay isn't okay. Call a cab, a car, or a friend.
Good choice.
Well, Thomas, you've got prediabetes. But with more exercise and a change in diet, it can be reversed.
I've tried exercising. It just makes me hungry for bacon.
I love bacon, too. And who really likes to exercise?
Not me.
Me neither.
Nobody. So we're good?
What? Oh, you still have prediabetes. Big time.
I'm Steve Potter. Welcome back to City Corner. Our guest today is Amanda Doyle. She, along with co-author Melanie Adams, have written a book, the St. Louis, or Standing Up for Civil Rights in St. Louis from the Missouri History Press. And I wanted to pick up on something, Amanda, we were talking about a minute ago. I read something out of your introduction. And you also talk a little bit, I hadn't thought of this, you kind of asked the question, well, what are civil rights? Mm-hmm. And I thought, boy, that is a term that covers a lot of territory. Maybe we should define that a little bit.
And when we talk to kids about it, we ask them what they think it is, because they've heard the word civil rights. But a lot of kids say, like, oh, it happened in the 50s, or it was this kind of, to them, it's sort of a discrete, event or moment. So civil rights, as we talk about it with young audiences, are the rights that we all have to equally do the things we do in public each day. So the right to go to a restaurant, the right to buy a house or rent an apartment in the neighborhood you choose, the right to go to a movie, go to a swimming pool, the right to get a job, to be hired for a job that you're qualified for, the right to go to a school that is, publicly open to people, without being told that you can't do it, basically.
Do you find it hard, and you made the point too, this book is designed with young people in mind, standing up for civil rights in St. Louis. Do they get it? Because now nobody thinks about people not being allowed to go to a public pool or live on a certain street. Do they get it?
I think it's really abstract for them. So, because that's not their reality. However, if you ask kids, do you have friends who look the same as you do, or do you have friends who look different than you do? Depending on where they live in St. Louis, that answer might be different. So they may attend a school that is all black, all white. Most of them, have friends of various races, but if you ask them, have you ever been to this particular neighborhood, or things like that, if you start to show them in their daily lives, like, well, here's something interesting, have you ever thought about this? They can see it a little bit, but I think it is really abstract for them. Mm-hmm. Because it seemed, to a kid, 20 years ago seems like the Stone Age. They don't have a concept of that in relation to their own lives. So one of the great things about the book, I think, is that we start before Missouri was a state, and we cover a lot of ground, but we come all the way through the events in Ferguson in 2014. So most of them do remember that something happened, that there were, crowds of people, there were protests, whatever it is they remember about it, that someone got shot, someone died. So we talk about that as a way to get into civil rights, because we can say, like, well, here's what some people said about that. So the person who was killed was a black teenager. The person, it gives you a way in to say this is what people were out in the streets talking about. Not just that, but they were saying that they've been unfairly treated for years, that their neighborhood needs services. Why is that? You can trace it all the way back through history. But it is hard. It's hard to make it real to them.
It's interesting. I really relate to the civil rights movement because of my age, I guess. When I was like 13, becoming a teenager, I was always really interested in politics and stuff in the news. Mm-hmm. And that's when a lot of civil rights stuff was happening on television. And I went to part of grade school, like 45 minutes from Newark, New Jersey, where they had race riots. I would see them on the news every day.
Right.
But this is the truth, and this was not by design or anything. This sounds funny to say. Do you know that I never met a black person until I was in college?
Yeah.
And it wasn't by design, or I just didn't, there were no black people in my school.
Right.
I never had an opportunity to meet a black person.
Yeah.
Doesn't that sound funny?
It does, but what's funny is you say it wasn't by design, and it's true. You didn't.
Well, not by design.
Exactly, but that's what I think is so interesting, because to me, it's amazing to see. I feel the same way. Like, well, I didn't personally do any of the things that have kind of led to these things, but there is a lot of design in these systems. It just wasn't our generation, or maybe even our parents' generation, but there have been. This is another thing I love to talk about with kids is, like, choices we make every day kind of set up how our city works, So if you say, well, this is the kind of money we're going to put into this neighborhood, or this is what you're going to, this is where we're going to direct our time, it eventually does have a consequence. But and it is not amazing to think about, like, you just lived in a whole different world, and it just never. I know. I feel the same way.
St. Louis says it's up. I want you to tell me if it's fair or not. Where you talk about white people living in certain neighborhoods and black in the others. St. Louis seems to have a reputation where that happens more than anywhere else. How true is that? That's, you've heard that.
For sure, that it's a very segregated city. I would say that I mean, it's fair. I think you can look at data and say that it's true. Like, I live in South City in St. Louis, and it's a fairly mixed racially area. I mean, depends on how big you draw the circle. So I would say there are areas where there are black and white people living together, but there are definitely all black neighborhoods, you know? I don't know if there are as many all white neighborhoods, but there are definitely areas that have really been just white people have just not been there in decades.
One point you make in your book I think is really interesting, that you point out the difference between being a slave and being enslaved.
Yeah. So when we started writing the book, it's just like things like that can really, I think, give people a different way to look at things. So for a long time we talked about, you know, slavery. People were slaves. That's how we referred to them. In the book, we try to use the term enslaved and enslaved person, enslaved woman, enslaved man, because being a slave was not all there was to that person. So when you say slave, it's like you just dismiss it entirely. These were people who had very horrible circumstances in some cases, but they were not just slaves. They had more to their lives than that. So just saying enslaved, and also that kind of assigns some responsibility outside of that person. Enslaved means someone was the person who enslaved them. So it kind of takes it away from this passive, like, well, they were just a slave, that's how it was, to really pointing out it was a relationship. It was a power relationship where there was someone who was the owner and someone who was the owned.
Right.
So, yeah.
Let's look at a couple images from your book,
Sure,
Standing
yeah.
Up for Civil Rights in St. Louis. And this first one, I think, refers to something very recent, although your book goes way back to even before Missouri was a state.
Right.
But so this is Ferguson?
Yes, so the book has historical photographs in it, which are really cool, but we also have commissioned illustrations from an artist named Darnell Chambers, who did some of the art that's in the History Museum exhibit as well. So this is the lineup that happened night after night in Ferguson in 2014, showing the police officers on one side and sort of the community and the protesters on the other. And in the foreground, you know, you've got the young kid with his arm up in a Black Power salute. So it's kind of provocative, but it's meant to be. You know, it's meant to show, like, the question we ask in the book is what's happened in Ferguson and what continues to happen in Ferguson part of the civil rights movement? You know, it's an interesting question. Like, is this still a civil rights question? Is it just kind of a protest movement? What's the relationship between what we see today and this long history in St. Louis?
Well, let's go to the next image and we'll go back in history, back to 1819.
Right. So the exhibit makes the point that the first civil rights demonstration in the history of the country happened in St. Louis in 1819. This is on the steps of the courthouse.
The first in the country.
That is the claim of the, I mean, I wasn't there, but it's an interesting proposition. So yes, because Missouri wanted to come into the United States, wanted to come into the Union, and there was a debate about whether it would be allowed to enter as a slave state or whether it would be a free state. So St. Louis actually had a population of free black people in the city as well as slaves, which is interesting as well. So we had, you didn't necessarily know the status of a black person just by seeing that they were a black person. So many of the free blacks who were in St. Louis united with white abolitionists to protest against Missouri coming in as a slave state.
Back in that time, were any of the free black people successful in business or economically?
For sure. Yep. There was a small group in St. Louis that was actually very well-to-do, had a whole social circuit around them. There's some really great books written about some of the early free black families in St. Louis.
We have an image of a gentleman that's featured in your book, and I've never heard his name, and I'm probably not the only one.
This is James Milton Turner. So James Milton Turner was pretty amazing. He was born into slavery. His father actually worked to earn money to purchase his freedom. So when he was 4, he was purchased out of slavery by his father. And he went on to become active in just about every social cause for the advancement of African Americans you could think of. So he was really involved in equal access to education. He worked for a while once the state decreed that there had to be free and equal schools available to everyone, which was after the Civil War. He was hired by the state to go around to every little town in Missouri and make sure that was happening. As you can imagine, he wasn't real popular in some places where they didn't want to be providing for education to black students. So he lived a life sometimes in danger. He actually helped found what became Lincoln University later. So there was no aspect of social activism that he didn't touch.
And your book covers a lot of individuals like that, all the way up to some people that are still in the scene today, like Percy Green.
Percy Green, Frankie Muse Freeman, some of the people who have passed somewhat recently, but people who were involved in the 50s and 60s in the Corps and in a lot of the social movements that happened around then. Yeah, it's really cool to still have such a living legacy here.
Yeah, a lot of things you'd book. I'm just going to pick out a couple things. One thing jumped out to me because, I have some Alton connections,
Yeah.
which I'm very proud of. And I love the Elijah P. Lovejoy story because he was a St. Louis businessman who ended up in Alton, and what a story that was.
Right. He published...
Why there's never been a movie about Elijah P. Lovejoy, I will never understand.
Why you should write the screenplay.
I thought about it.
Okay, let's do it. We'll
serious.
talk after the
No,
show.
I'm serious.
Okay, I don't know anything about it.
We'll talk later.
I mean, I know a little bit, but yes. Well, so Elijah P. Lovejoy published a newspaper, and in addition to just
in St. Louis.
Yes, in St. Louis, and in addition to the sort of news part, he editorialized constantly against slavery and against sort of basically the racism that was everywhere at the time. He was a strong abolitionist. He was not popular for those views among a lot of people, and he was kind of chased across the river, basically.
He moved his
whole
business
press,
over there.
everything, right, to Alton, and that did not get him away from the people who wanted to silence him. And so eventually he was actually killed, and his press thrown into the river,
The warehouse set on fire.
the whole place destroyed, yeah.
I was right down there where the Argosy Casino is now, right down in that
Yes.
part of town.
Right. So, but he, and that's the thing, we kind of, we know some of the stories of like white allies and abolitionists who were really involved in the movement, and who were really important because they were kind of bridge messengers to a segment of the white community that was not going to hear other voices.
So Elijah Lovejoy is probably someone most kids read about, at least briefly, in school.
Right.
Pick out somebody that we've never heard of that you think's interesting.
Oh gosh, there are so many.
And we just have like a minute left.
Yeah, okay, so some people may have heard of, but this is a Supreme Court case that started in St. Louis and went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it was a student named Lloyd Gaines who wanted to go to law school at the University of Missouri. And he was an African-American student. He was excellent valedictorian, had done so well, and he was denied entry to the law school. The court, because he was black. So the case was taken to court. It was ruled on various times, overturned, the Missouri Supreme Court. So finally, the U.S. Supreme Court said, the state of Missouri has to admit him to the law school, or they have to provide a literal, separate but equal institution for him. They can't pay to send him out of state or anything like that. So they set up a whole separate college just for black law students because they didn't want them at the University of Missouri.
One of the dozens and dozens of interesting stories that people will find in your book. And again, you and Melanie are going to be somewhere on February the 10th.
Yep, at the Flow Valley branch of the St. Louis County Library, 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
And who's invited to that?
Everyone, bring your kids. It'll be a lot of fun.
All right. Well, standing up for civil rights in St. Louis, Amanda Doyle, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for helping to tell this fascinating story. And the book is sort of designed for kids, but adults will like it too, I guarantee it.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks.
I'm Steve Potter. That's all the time we have for City Corner today. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.